Mink. Zaraz ci dam. Wszystko będzie.
Będziemy zaczynać. Proszę, mogę pana poprosić na chwilę? Żeby przykleić mikrofon, podkleić. Przepraszam, czy jest sam mówię,
Pomóż. Działa? Dobra. Ja wiem, tylko ten dobrze działa, ja wiem. Tylko jeszcze... Proszę Państwa, zaczynamy.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Witam Państwa po sesji postępowej.
Welcome after the poster session. I'm very glad that it was of interest to you. I observed what was happening and I thought that the session was successful. There were some interesting ideas. You were helpful. This will be subject of articles and books in the future. Now let's move on to the session that is going to be devoted to the military issues, military and diplomatic issues. We have very special guests here with us this afternoon. It is not frequent at conferences of this kind to have two generals on one panel, and we do indeed have two today, but we also have experienced diplomats. But before I introduce everyone, let us begin as planned from what, the video or the address by the general? The address by the general, thank you. Mykhailo Koval, the deputy head of the National Security Bureau in Ukraine. We met in Kiev once when he was a Minister of Defense soon after the revolution. I recall that this was a very emotional meeting, very exciting. And now from this time perspective, I'd like to ask you to take the floor. Thank you very much for coming here despite this very special time at work. And I'd like to ask you to give a brief introduction, and then we will hold a discussion. And in the second part of our discussion, we will hold a direct conversation with the participants of the war. And we have about 90 minutes for all that. Over to you, sir.
Я вітаю всіх тих, хто приймає участь. З вашого дозволу.
I'd like to thank you and welcome all the participants of the session. I will deliver my speech standing. As our chair has mentioned, I had the honor to head over the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine for 3.5 months. And indeed, my short intervention will complete those of my fellow citizens who recalled all the events that took place in the stormy 2014. Let me just say that the aggression of the Russian Federation and the annexation of Crimea had been in the forecast for a long time, and I say that as a military man and as a participant of the events of 2003. Around the Tuzla Island, in the Kerchenska Bay, where I was the head of the Ukrainian border guards who prevented Russia from the annexation of Tuzla Island. So as a military man, I already at the time was aware of what Russia was planning with reference to Crimea and what was happening at the time in Ukraine. Deliberately, the defense capacity of the state was lowered, and the military, as well as other units that had impact on the defense of the nation. All of that was done when Yanukovych was prime minister over 2 terms of office, and between 2010 and 2014 when Yanukovych was president of Ukraine. It was at that time that the military in Crimea was reduced. The 32nd Armed Corps and the units therein were reduced. The management of the corps and its components, if they had been supported by army from the remaining parts of Ukraine, they would have been able to effectively defend Crimea from the annexation. This corps was dislocated, and only 2 units remained: 36th Brigade, a separate infantry battalion, and coastal defense battalions in Kort. And I'm just talking about the combat units. We also have auxiliary units. So the combat value of those units was lowered. Why am I talking about left bank? Crimea was explicitly referred to, and all the areas that were on the left bank, so Sumsk, Kharkovo, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and the districts that were on the Black Sea, Khersonsk, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. So all of those districts were part of Russia's plan to recreate the Russian Spring. Now, lowering the combat capacity of the Ukrainian units in left bank Ukraine. Earlier there were regiments, divisions, and brigades. At the beginning, at the initial stage of annexation, only one artillery regiment was left. In Odessa, we only had a missile regiment, and on the right bank, in the Dniepropetrovsk, we had one brigade, the 23rd and the 28th Brigade at Odessa. All the remaining units were destroyed, and it was all deliberate. So also on the left bank, the army potential was lowered. There were explosions, and when during Yanukovych's office, the ministers of defense were two citizens of the Russian Federation who deliberately destroyed the armed forces of Ukraine. I served in the army for 22 years. As a paratrooper, and in all the armies these units are very important, whereas in Ukraine those units that should react immediately to a crisis situation had been destroyed. They had no preparedness, as the doctrine would require. So when we look at this from the point of view of the doctrine, in 2010-2014, the enemy in the doctrine were countries west of Ukraine. So all the units of the armed forces in Ukraine were prepared, even with their limited capacity, were directed to Romania, Poland, and West Ukraine, and they awaited a strike from there. So we can see that the potential of the Ukrainian army was very much limited. So what happened in February and March 2014? My colleagues told me about the events in Crimea, but I want to take a soldier's perspective. I listed 3 units, 1 brigade and 2 battalions that were able to act in Crimea. They could have been reinforced at the end of February by deploying forces from the remaining parts of Ukraine. There was very little in terms of armed forces in Crimea, and Russians took their time to prepare for the operations. They recruited people, and most soldiers of the Ukrainian army were from Crimea. And what did the Russians do? They released an officer, and all the officers from other regions of Russia were sent to the Crimea. They were overtly pro-Russian. Another thing is that due to the problems that were experienced, most officers and soldiers that were in the military units in the autonomous area were from Crimea. So their views were also openly pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian. So what happened at the end of February? You are aware that the internal forces came back from Kiev, demoralized. The brigade had no combat capacity because the commander had surrendered the brigade to the Russian Federation. Today he's a general in the Russian army. We only had 1 storm battalion. At the time, I accepted the position of the minister on the 25th of April, and there was just 1 commander of the unit that was prepared to act in the interest of Ukraine. And the biggest brigade land was lacked a commandership. There was lack of infantry. There were very young boys. They held on for a very long time. They followed the orders that were given them. There was no treason there, but all the officers and soldiers completed their vows. But the 1st Battalion surrendered, and so did other commanders. Those who claim that you could have disobeyed there are lying, because there was no room, there was no potential for such disobedience. Russia, under the pretense of the Sochi Olympic Games, had prepared great groupings of armed forces. I will list some of the units so that you can double check, so that you don't think that I'm lying. These groupings, after the Olympic Games, were introduced to the Crimea. There are 2 Spetsnaz brigades, the 10th Brigade and the 22nd Stepnoy. This is a Marine 372 Marine Battalion, 104th Regiment that was deployed to Crimea with planes. 31st Aerial Brigade from Ulyanovsk that was also deployed there. So these units were very much reinforced. This operation had been prepared thoroughly. All the military exercises had been carried out. And what happened was that a state that had entered the Budapest Memorandum had entered the Crimea. Nobody had expected that they were going to stab us in the back. Also, as reserve to that force, next to Crimea, there was the 7th Aerial Division and 2 regiments, composed of 2 regiments. And those forces were also ready to start combat. You know that President Yanukovych and his government left for the Russian Federation. So here's the situation. Our army starts operating in Crimea. The reserve of the 7th Division enters, and there were 2 Russian divisions, 98th Ivanovska and 3 aerial brigades, 56th at the Volga and 83rd and 11th. And please believe me, if only our army had started defending Crimea, then immediately forces would have been deployed to all the 4 airports. The paratroopers would have been deployed, and this would have been a slaughter. So those patriots who were in charge of the revolution and who stood up to prevent the annexation of Crimea, they all would have been trapped. They would have been shot on the spot, both in continental Ukraine and the peninsula. There would have been great losses in human life. So this briefly summarizes the situation in Crimea and what happened in Donbass. As military men, we understand that Putin if only he had attacked Crimea, we would have done anything to save it. But since Crimea was very quick and easy to conquer, then the following elements of the Russian Spring Plan were put into place on the east bank. Similar actions were attempted, but if this succeeded in Crimea and only 1 Ukrainian soldier was dead, as well as our brothers, the Tatars, who opposed the annexation, here, well, there were those nice green men that hid behind women and children. In Donetsk and Lugansk, Gherkin's people shot our Spetsnaz from Alpha. They shot the captain who had 3 children. No questions asked. They just straightforward. This was just straightforward shooting. That night, I was in the capacity of the Minister of Defense, and I was in touch all the time with Mr. Turchinov, the acting president. When we found out that they arrived, Turchinov asked me, "Who have we got there?" And this is no secret if I say that the armed forces of Ukraine in the Donetsk and Luhansk district were not admitted. In early April, we succeeded in only deploying 1 battalion of the 25th Aerial Brigade. Then we reintroduced another battalion in the north of the Lugansk battalion. That was the 93rd Mechanized Brigade from Dnieper. It was blocked at the railway station in Luhansk. In other words, it was military men, Ukrainian armed forces were prevented from entering the area. I was a colonel at the time of the border guards, and I sent my troops there as well as reinforcement. So as an example, let me tell you that our armed forces were prevented from reaching the border. This was a very deliberately planned Russian operation. Our column that was there was blocked by the local people, women, men, elderly. They blocked our equipment, and they said that the Banderovцы were not going to be allowed to the east. I thought that there were people we knew, but they were our former soldiers. I recognized them and I said, "What are you doing here?" And he told me, we were not allowing fascists to pass. And I asked him, "But am I a fascist?" And I asked him, "Where are you?" "I live in Rostov at the Don." So what are you doing here, Alexander?" I asked him. And he told me that his duty was not to let us pass. He then withdrew his people. But women would remain. And it's difficult to talk to them because they wouldn't allow the retreat. So the men withdrew. And then the deputies from the Donetsk district to the parliament, well, the women became more and more aggressive after the men withdrew. So the army and the border guards were not allowed. So what happened in the Donetsk and Lugansk districts? In fact, the security services betrayed us. The militia betrayed us, and the army was not even present. So this is what happened. And I should also tell you that when these events took place, in fact, the Ukrainian army was not operational. The 18th Regiment from Lviv was on its way. It was the commander was Volchyn, and I told him, "Victor, could you at least give me 1 unit to assess me?" This was 50 kilometers away or something, and it was in the evening when we spoke. He said, "Yes, I will do as you told me." Over the mobile phone as Minister of Defense, I said, "Yes, this is my order. I'm giving you this order." So this officer took 100 paratroopers and started heading over in that direction. Everything was blocked. At 4 a.m. they entered Sloviansk, and the management was going to also be present. And I said that some of the management of the Ukrainian security services and should be there. Paratroopers entered the city, did a reconnaissance, and they saw two spots and two groups of separatists that had already taken charge. They should have blocked those units, but as soon as our soldiers appeared there, then the local population, that was at night, immediately said that the Ukrainian soldiers were there, and at night, the 14th of April 2014, the barricade was erected, and nothing succeeded. We had to retreat to Izum, where we created our base, and then we started getting reinforcements. So that's an example of preparedness. There was no plan of recruitment, mobilization. A soldier that was recruited had no equipment, had no uniform. This was March and April, and the acting president Turchinov ordered 500 sets of uniforms, but had forgotten them. So unless you've experienced that, you might ask a question: why all this came into fruition? It was difficult to for them to start shooting, and the first bullets were shot by separatists at the Alpha soldiers. It was only then that our soldiers started responding with fire.
After that, we engaged the military, the armed forces, with better trained soldiers, and after the events in Ługańsk on the 14th, we launched the anti-terrorist operation. So no detachment arrived to Donbass or Donetsk without having been adequately prepared, and we started working systematically. And finally, let me say that I can quote numbers. The regular army entered, Russian regular army entered the territory of Ukraine in 2014. I can quote the numbers, the naming of the detachments and the commanders. Based on that, the 8th Army was formed near Ługańsk, deployed in Nowocherkask. 150th Division was formed at Kuźniec and Kodamsk, and these are not ordinary divisions. They are, out of the 6 regiments, 4 of them are general military, and there are 2 tank detachments and an artillery regiment, anti-aircraft, and divisions 133 and 134 on the Ukrainian-Belarus border. So that's all from me. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for this interesting account. Now we will have viewing of a filmed account.
світанні, сонце й дим. Мало хто знає, що ж буде з ним, що буде завтра.
za pomoc w przygotowaniu tego materiału.
We are grateful for this material. Well, our formula is known to you. We are not after presentation by experts, but rather comments. There are lots of questions, and it's an exceptional opportunity to talk to a witness of the events, having hands-on experience of these events. So we have an expert from the School of Business in Riga, expert in military matters and in political transition, experience advising government on education, justice and security. So please, could you briefly comment, focusing on questions important from the students, from the researchers' point of view?
Yes.
Mike.
Are we on? I was actually in the Ministry of Defence when the General was Minister. He may not remember, but I went into the Ministry in May 2014, and then basically I was there for 3 weeks working as trying to help the Deputy Minister then, Igor Kovalenko. And then I was back in and out of Ukraine, or have been back in and out of Ukraine almost every other week for the last 4 years. And I was living there for the last 16 months. So there are lots of areas of discussion that I think are quite important. I think that the first one is obviously is the changes that have taken place within the defence system have been dramatic, especially the way the soldiers are fighting on the front line. The big question is how much of that is institutionalized. In other words, are they changing because Russia is actually fighting them, so you have to fight back? Or are they changing because the actual Ukrainian training system is improving? And there's a big question about whether the training in performance in training is because of the American, Canadian, British, Lithuanian, Polish support for them. And if you took that away, whether the institution itself would actually be able to adapt and carry on. And I think that's one area. And then a second area is the Ministry of Defence itself, which has had volunteers working with it in the Reform Office solidly now for the last 3 years. But the question is whether, again, whether the Reform Office is still outside of the Ministry of Defence. In other words, it's not gone inside. It's inside the main gate, but it's not inside the building. And if you actually took away those volunteers who are working and doing a lot of changes for things like food, uniforms, logistic support, e-procurement for things, if you took those volunteers away, if the Ministry of Defence itself has actually adapted and changed. And so those are two very, very big areas of question and research that actually historians are going to look back on. And I've just written an article about changing the army, which was published in Kiev Post, and it caused a lot of unhappiness in some quarters, a lot of support in other quarters. I had something like 1,000 volunteers come onto my Facebook within 2 weeks, basically telling me that that I'd put my finger on the painful point. And it's so there's a big question at the moment about the army and about the system, of whether it's actually embracing the change in values that we've been talking about, or whether it's still Soviet. And I look forward to hearing what other people have got to say about that.
Może poprosimy o następny komentarz pana Stefana Hedlunda.
We would now like to ask Mr. Stefan Hedlund, a Swedish expert on Russian and Soviet relations and a professor of European studies at the University of Uppsala. The professor has recently published a book on Putin and energy agenda. So may we ask you for your comments, please.
Thank you. I think when the time comes to write the history of what has happened in Ukraine, the really big question will be, I mean, how could we spend so much time discussing if this is war or not? How can we still be involved in discussing if the Russians are involved here or not? And how can so many people still take this seriously? And I think this sort of reflects the unpreparedness of the West, the US, the EU, whatever you want to call it, in approaching and standing up to what the Russians have done in Ukraine. Every time I talk about these things, I love to return to one of my favorite quotes from Teddy Roosevelt, who once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick and you will get far." What has been done in the case of Ukraine is the opposite. Speak loudly and carry a wet noodle and Putin will not be impressed. And it's very popular to state that there is no military solution in Ukraine, which is obviously wrong. I mean, there is one. Putin has established one. I think Putin is now pretty pleased with himself, what he has achieved. And I'm not quite convinced that there were plans to go further than what has already been done. He has achieved quite important strategic goals with military means. So this is a military solution. And we are trying to approach a military solution with talk and insults and heaping abuse on Russia and on Putin, just making him even more angry. What is so special about this war between states fought inside Ukraine, that is hybrid. I don't really like the notion of hybrid warfare because it's been going on since the ancient Greeks and the Romans were at it. But what is really new is deniability. I mean, the very fact that one of the warring parties claims, "I'm not there," and we'll let them get away with it. And I think the importance of deniability here is that deniability works only as long as it's kept on a very low level. And the war that is going on in Donbass, I mean, it's not high-tech stuff, right? It's pretty primitive from a military point of view. It's not, there is nothing very sophisticated happening. I mean, it's extremely brutal, but there is nothing very sophisticated. So if, I think this is the main argument in favor of arming Ukraine that you don't see very often. If we were to, or the US or whoever, were to provide more sophisticated weapons for Ukraine, Russia would have to escalate. And of course it would. But if Russia escalates its actions in Donbass, deniability will be gone. And then it will be obvious that we have a war between states. And in that case, the UN and other mechanisms of international conflict resolution will kick in.
Ale może świat potrzebuje tej hipokryzji, żeby nie zdefiniować.
But maybe the world needs this hypocrisy not to clearly define the situation. Maybe diplomatically it makes sense.
This has been one of the main arguments, that if we allow Putin to get away with not being involved, we will give him an off-ramp, a way of getting out of the mess. But this presumes that he wanted to get out of the mess in the first place. I mean, if what has happened in Ukraine is exactly what he wanted to happen, then providing him with a way out via the Minsk process, if he doesn't really want a way out, sort of takes the weapons out of our hands and just ensures that he will walk away with the spoils. And of course, sanctions are hurting Russia, but we must be very clear in drawing a line between sanctions that are retribution, which is the case, and sanctions that are deterrence. And the sanctions that have been heaped on Russia, it doesn't even come close to deterrence. The pain is just not there.
Jest jeszcze inna hipoteza, może to jest...
Well, maybe another hypothesis, the fear of escalation, because Putin is unpredictable and therefore he might escalate, so the West is staying low-key.
That if Ukraine is provided with heavy armaments, Russia will escalate and more people will get killed. But this is the situation we're ended up in. Either you do a deal with Putin and Russia, or you take a hardline stance and stand up to Putin, because sanctions is what governments do when they don't know what to do, right? And sanctions never work. I mean, we hung sanctions on China in 1989. They're still there. They didn't work, right? North Korea, Cuba, whatever. So sanctions is something we do for feel-good factor. We feel good because we hung sanctions on Putin. He doesn't care about it. I mean, okay, so Russia may have lost a percentage GDP growth last year. So what to him? I mean, the cost is absorbed by the Russian people, and they love what he's doing anyway. So it's totally ineffectual in that sense. It is retribution. I mean, Russia is suffering. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. Russia is suffering from the sanctions. But so are others. I mean, look at the pain to German industry. Look at the pain to ExxonMobil that lost maybe $1 billion.
Jeśli można, chciałbym włączyć do dyskusji.
I'm sorry, but I would like to ask Professor Lubaczka, who has also General Pacek, who would like to comment on the experience of the other general. Thank you very much. I would rather present in brief not so much my views as results of research. I managed a group of representatives of various NATO members analyzing the hybrid war in Ukraine. I've even published a book on it, presenting it in detail. Well, the first thing is the purpose, the objective. Escalation, in my view, doesn't apply here. The purpose, the objective of Putin is to turn around Ukraine from being Western-oriented rather than warfare for this or that goal. And the second objective is to undermine the West's unity, which, according to Putin, has gone too far with regards to Ukraine. Well, today we apply fairly light language for the beginnings of the conflict. This is not war, formally speaking, but armed conflict. So it's a conflict, so military activity without declaring war, without observing the Geneva Conventions and so on. So it's military armed forces activities, a broader concept than a war. So euphemistically, we have heard that Ukraine was completely unprepared, and it's such a scandal, and it's so incomprehensible that Ukraine was better prepared for the World War I than for today's 21st century warfare. And I say this based on experience of the soldiers who participated. The West was also unprepared. It had made promises to Ukraine, raising its expectations. But when the war started, the West didn't know how to react. It was also a masterpiece on the part of Russia, not starting in February or March of 2014. It was started much earlier, if we understand hybrid warfare as very extensive activities of civilian soldiers, political measures, not only military, which strike the enemy or the other side. So it's not hybrid war with Ukraine, but hybrid war on the waged against the West, of which Ukraine is only a part. First of all, Putin didn't anticipate that this would be a positive trigger for Ukraine to consolidate, which was rather fragmented before in terms of national identity and national unity. It was a problem in Ukraine. Putin, by his aggression, actually stimulated patriotism, the love of your country in Ukraine. And it also caused the awakening of the leadership, because if the general mentioned betrayal, it applies to Russia, but also to many people in Ukraine, including highest level in the armed forces, in the police, in business, everywhere, in the administration. The Crimea is the best example. I have described this in detail. Commanders of units asked their superiors in Kiev to allow them to defend, and they were told to wait. And this is proven. So many people acted as agents of influence for Russia in Ukraine for a long time before the actual aggression. There were a lot of incredible, unimaginable aspects have changed in Ukraine, but still not enough is changing in Ukraine, in the economy, in corruption. But the army has changed very greatly, from uniforms through arms, through training. The Ukrainian army is today prepared at least for Second World War standards, and now the point is to reach ability to stand up to current challenges. Not everything is perfect, of course. Time is passing, and Ukrainian society sees that the war goes on, but the nation has mobilized around this war, starting to support the military, and civil society is supporting the people who are fighting. Well, a dozen or so battalions were formed in Kiev and Azov, over a dozen, of volunteers who have organized themselves and have fought on the front like a regular army. So this is unimaginable for other countries that this is feasible. But in Poland, we tend to appraise things either black or white, but things have changed, and today there is not so much enthusiasm, and despite the fact that soldiers are trained and uniformed, they are subject to the same processes as society at large. And so there is disillusionment. That's a new word in Ukraine, often repeated, that they are disillusioned. They would like to have more and quicker, and many changes should be faster. Now let me invite Mr. Perepelytsya, a man of letters and academician. So how would you comment on the word disillusionment? Is this the right word to describe the current attitude of Ukrainian society, the population, to the situation on the war front? And how do you perceive the knowledge, the awareness of Ukrainians on actual threats? Maybe expectations are greater than real capacity of the Ukrainian army.
Згідно, так би мовити, нашої офіційної позиції,
According to our official position, what we see in the information news area, there is no hybrid war anymore. We have hybrid peace, and that's a large, major problem. The concept of hybrid peace exists, and we are trying to imagine that there is no longer a war and that everything is fine. Of course, there are separatists and terrorists in Donbass somewhere, but that generally everything's fine. So such a concept of hybrid peace leads to a disillusionment, because people are dying in Donbass every day. We suffer losses, but not everyone understands that, because when earlier soldiers were buried with honors, today all of that happens quietly, so that no one is worried that we've had a war for 4 years. And that is a major problem, not just for the Ukrainian society, but for the armed forces as well, because it is in this format that soldiers are demoralized in the armed forces. And there is a fatigue with this long-lasting, undefined situation where there is neither peace nor the war. And such a situation may last for a very long time. This, of course, is part of Putin's plan, who is conducting a long-lasting war of fatigue. And such a war takes place when there are more resources. Russia can withstand the sanctions, and it has already demonstrated that it's capable of doing so. And as General Kowal has said, Russia is increasing its military capacity, and not only along the Ukrainian border. The military exercise in the West 2017 demonstrated that Russia is getting prepared for a war with NATO. It is preparing at the eastern NATO flank its army, and everybody can see that. Now, the type of war that Russia is going to initiate with NATO is something that we're not able to tell at this point, but we can say for sure that Ukraine will be the theater of that warfare. Perhaps we will be meeting at a third conference if we manage to gather. And if Putin's plan is put into action, because Putin started this war not just against Ukraine. And Ukraine wasn't the main reason for that war. The main reason for that war is his willingness to change the world order. Since the Russian society is very clearly aware that Russia, in the Russian Federation format, is the rudiment of the Soviet Union. It's one of the Soviet Union republics, and recently Putin, during a federal meeting, said that the Soviet Union was Russia, and that we should all revive and reinforce Russia. And so what does that thesis say? It unequivocally says that Russia is supposed to be reborn not only on the surface area of the Soviet Union, but it's supposed to be reborn as a superpower and supposed to lead the world order. That's Putin's aim. So he started that war not just against Ukraine, that is the heated phase of that war, but a war is being waged against Europe, also in a hybrid format against the US. It's not very noticeable, and due to the fact that it's not very noticeable, that makes us all very weak. And going back to the conference, in our panel, it says it talks about the consequences of the war in Eastern Europe. Let me just interrupt to address a question to you and to General Pacek as well. Namely, we have already determined that this is the Russian army, that they're not the separatists, they are marginal vis-à-vis the Russian army. But how does this happen? We remember the effect of Afghanistan and the comeback of coffins to Russia. How does it happen that when coffins come back to Ukraine, that's a shock, but we hear nothing about Russia, about the coffins going back to Russia? We are aware that the coffins that come back from Syria are those of individual soldiers, but what happens if there is an actual, real Russian army in Ukraine? General, please. The issue is that both the 1st and the 2nd Corps of the Russian Federation armed forces that are included in the 8th Army are in the occupied territory of the Lugansk and Donetsk districts. These forces, these soldiers are mainly local inhabitants, and a great majority of them are specialists. There are people who went through the private armies modeled on Wagner that we spoke about, and the commandership, the generals and commanders of our officers. For example, the commander of the 1st Corps is Roman Reus. He is the commander of the 7th Aerial Division, and this chief of staff is a Russian hero, Anashkin, General Anashkin. He used to be the commander of the 31st Brigade of paratroopers in Ulyanovsk. So the commanders are Russians, Russian officers, and the soldiers, the combat soldiers, are citizens, inhabitants of Lugansk and Donetsk district, and representatives of the private contract armies. Until recently, there were units of tactical forces of the Ivanovsk division. It had already been taken out, stationed in Donetsk. The tactical group of the 20th Brigade from Volgograd in Snezhne. And the tactical campaign that was positioned in Lugansk of the 7th Division that was also taken out of that territory, but all of that heavy Russian equipment is still located on the occupied districts. That's why the Russian Federation, when it included the 1st and the 2nd Corps, which is commanded by the 8th Army of the Russian Federation, from the reserves of those units that are stationing close to the Ukrainian border, they may just overnight introduce their people, and 8 to 10 combat groups can be in full preparedness. There are no regular Russian troops, but the 1st and 2nd Corps are part of the 8th Russian Army, and they are under the commandership of the same commanders, and their exercises are carried out in the 1st and 2nd Corps. They're in the 8th Army. Recently, the 9th Regiment of Marines came together with an official visit of the Ministry of Defense, who dismissed the commanders, and now a procedure was put in place concerning the theft of fuel in that corps, and we know that the system is being under the command of the Russian army. We're just discussing. Please use your microphone. Until now, we are talking about a war in east of Ukraine, but we're not talking about the Russian-Ukrainian war, and that's a mistake. Like yourself, I wrote a book. It's not the same book. Let's see which one's better. But gentlemen, please, when we talk about the consequences of that war, what we should understand are the errors that the Ukrainian authorities' activities led to, and the mistakes of the West. But what are those mistakes, to be precise? Okay, let's move on. One of such mistakes of Ukraine was that we did not call the war. We did not call it by its name from the very beginning. And as a result of that, the management ignored the Ukrainian constitution and the Act on Defense of Ukraine, which stipulate exactly what the political and military authorities should do in the event of aggression. The next mistake, having failed to do that, we lost Crimea. What's more, the political and military authorities are wondering how to get out of this situation, and instead of going back to the Ukrainian legislation, which specifies everything in details, they opted for anti-terrorist operations, and they confirm hereby that this is a domestic conflict. So instead of applying defense measures, they started using anti-terrorist measures. Do you see any advantages of this solution, or are you only critical of it? Well, I'm critical of it because as a result of this, the situation got into a cul-de-sac. So if you are familiar with Ukrainian constitution, the 17th article of the constitution bans the application of armed forces inside the country. And if it were to be an anti-terrorist operation, as General Kowal has suggested, they armed forces are banned, and as a result of these failures, very briefly, it's not true. It's not as if I disagree with my predecessors. that this is a typical Ukrainian-Russian war with Ukrainian army on the one hand and Russian army on the other. And this is what happened in Crimea, whether they were green men or regular army. This was a typical armed conflict between two states. Today, I agree with Minister and General Koval that Russians train and support and give weapons, but those who shoot every day are, to a large extent, are inhabitants of Ukraine. They are called Opolchensi, they are separatists. So this is where the difficulty of that war lies, because if these were just Ukrainian and Russian armed forces, they could exit based on political negotiations. I cannot give you the floor. Now, Professor Stępniewski, who researches hybrid warfare, please make a dynamic contribution to this discussion. It doesn't matter about how long, but we need to keep this discussion going. I think that we're making a strategic mistake by combining Donbass with Crimea. The war has been going on for 4 years running. We need to be aware that the aims of Russia towards Crimea are different than they are towards Donbass. When we look at strategic goals of the Soviet Union and the current Russian Federation, they have remained unchanged. To maintain influence in the Soviet area, that's a neutral policy. The more Ukraine approaches NATO, the more pressure Russia will exert over Ukraine. Secondly, this is an attempt to reintegrate the former Soviet territory if they can at least annex the Crimea and Donbass. Thirdly, Central European states should be cautious in their policies towards the Russian Federation. And fourthly, which we tend to forget, the aim of Russia is to institutionalize European security, to establish a new rule book. And those are the goals of Russia towards that area and Europe as such. At this point, what is important, we're not looking at a Ukrainian conflict with Russia. Let's remember that Russians are testing new weapons in Syria. Russians have a military base in Syria. They have strategically surrounded Turkey, a NATO member state. The geopolitical status quo is changing in Central and Eastern Europe, and Crimea is needed from the strategic point of view because we are no longer talking about diversification of energy resources through the Black Sea, because Russians have Crimea, and together with Turkey they can decide about the area of the Black Sea. Turkey has also been surrounded by Russian forces, which completely changes the distribution in this part of the world. And I think that Donbass, from Russia's point of view, is needed to create a frozen conflict and to have influence over the internal and external policy. But the game is to incorporate Donbass, because huge money has to be paid for the reconstruction of Donbass, and Russia is reluctant to do that. Okay, we put a full stop here. Short interventions from Mr. Hedlund and Grant, if you would like.
Very short. I think all this business of how the Russians are moving in and out of Ukraine and illustrates just how important deniability is for them. And it's more for domestic reasons than for international reasons. I mean, cargo 200, is it? Dead bodies coming home is not a very good thing for Putin. And this then obviously is their main vulnerability. And just remember what happened in Syria 2 weeks ago when the Wagner outfit sent about 500 people to attack with heavy mechanized units to attack American-supported guerrillas. Then the Americans called the Russians and said, we're gonna strike. Are you there? And they of course they had to say, no, okay. So the Americans called in airstrikes and killed maybe 200 Russians.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan Grant chciał się włączyć jeszcze?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make a point, having heard some comments, a sort of hybrid peace comment, and you know, again, comment of what's important, is it Crimea or Donbass in the big Russian picture, and that one of the things that concerns me is the fact that if it's seen as a hybrid peace or seen as a frozen conflict, that the military don't get better, they stay as they are. And you know, you made that they're at World War II standard if we're lucky at the moment, but they need to be at World War III and World War IV standard. So there's some huge technical and military steps to be taken by the army to get up to the next level. And there's a danger with these things that are being said, hybrid peace and things like that, that they don't bite the bullet and actually understand that people have got to change and the quality line has got to go up. And that's my big thesis at the moment, that you know, there is a worry from me as I look at it that I don't see this happening.
Bardzo dziękuję za tą uwagę. Proszę Państwa, chciałbym włączyć do dyskusji osoby, które...
I would like to invite to the discussion well-known diplomat in the shadow and important witness of what's been happening, a close Mr. Marian Staszewski, who was the deputy head of the contact group. But I don't ask about the war as such. Don't you have the impression that diplomats haven't done all they could not to allow this war to happen or to stop it? Was it at all feasible? Well, I think that what I'll say is speculation, not fact. But it seems to me that Russia, over the years, I'm talking about Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia's been in a situation similar to that of Turkey after World War I. So they started focusing, had the dilemma whether to rebuild its influence in the Mediterranean in the case of Turkey, or instead to focus on building an efficient democratic state. As we know, Atatürk took the second option, which wasn't easy. There was internal strife. In Russia, I believe, this controversy, which road Russia was to take, took 8 to 9 years. So it's not so much the matter of Putin's decision, but of the whole Russian elite. Over the years, opinions were divided as to what was happening in Georgia, Moldova and elsewhere. Whether these were secondary aftershocks of the fall of the and disintegration of the Soviet Union, or whether it was a deliberate strategy in the long term. But was it possible for the contact group to work differently to contain the war which is still ongoing in the east of Ukraine? Well, this indecision of the West and lack of clarity of the intentions of Russia. If there were more clear and assertive reactions, there have been interesting recommendations which are still actual, but they still remain as recommendations, as Daliavini recommendations. So certainly this had an impact, but as for diplomacy as such, there was no magical formula to change the situation. I believe that the Minsk talks and agreements do play a role, at least on the visible side. Ukraine's army was at the time in a very difficult situation. That's August 2014, where the Ukrainian army lost 90% of its heavy weapons, and then there was a very difficult winter of 2015 with Debaltseve and Mariupol, and then there was another effort to change the relation of forces. That was June 2015 under Marinko. And since then, the confrontation in Ukraine has changed. There were no efforts for a turnaround. on the military front. There was only positional and tactical warfare. The Russian forces showed initiative, had some tactical success, but nothing definite in terms of military significance. And as for further possibilities in the East, there have been interesting assessments, but it's all speculation. I believe that Russia's policy with regards to Ukraine was simply profitable for Russia. It has gained in Georgia and in Ukraine more than it lost in terms of casualties. But now in Syria, for the first time, there are some military and economic costs. So just a few words. I have come in June 2014, and one of the Western diplomats gave me an account of it was mid-June 2014, saying that Russia has like three swords on Ukraine's neck. There was gas, that it could just stop flowing and the Ukrainian economy would stop. The second is the Maidan, that they have a lot of influence over the radical groups which could cause problems for the government of Ukraine, and the rebellion in the east. And he didn't see how the new leadership in Ukraine could resolve any of these problems quickly. Well, of course, he was wrong. So it's an enormous success of Ukrainian leadership. It will be in future history textbooks that it solved the first problem. The second one, there is no Maidan anymore, and that Ukraine over 4 years has kept the ground on the front. It is a huge success on the part of Ukraine. So that's so much. Well, thanks to the Minsk process, Ukraine gained time for modernization. And here everyone agrees that we are dealing with separatists who are trained by Russian military experts. And if it is so, I'm no military expert in strategy, so why can't one go a step further and push out the separatists? Well, if not for Lugansk, the problem of Donbass would have been solved, because the Ukrainian army was very close to victory. Well, now a short break for a movie. Well, just one more word. Minsk is providing that since June 2014 there are no major military operations there. So there is a contribution of Minsk and that of the passage of time.
Mamy ten felieton filmowy?
To może ja chciałem dodać...
Nie, jeszcze sekundę.
Bo minutę mamy.
To w takim razie zapraszam...
Well, so I invite Mr. Władysław Kuczyński and Vitalii Ovcharenko.
Телеграфи мовчать, хтось зрадив ідею, всі втратили віру, але дивляться в небо, там апостоли грають у... Телеграфи мовчать, хтось зрадив ідею, всі втратили віру, але дивляться в небо, там апостоли грають у карти під скрегіт зубів. На розбитих іконах колишніх ідей плачуть горобці, бо в них Прометей забирає вогонь, щоб зігріти богів. І віяв вітер, плакали квіти. Боже, зглянься, це все твої діти, так жадібно вдихають грудьми запах війни. Хто вмирав 10 раз за волю, той знає справжню її ціну. Хто розгніваним бігав по полю, вбиваючи грім, піднімав цілину і скидаючи з себе Христа, бо не в змозі нести. 10 раз задля того вмирав, щоб знову воскрести. Віяв вітер, плакали квіти. Боже, зглянься, це все твої діти, так жадібно вдихають грудьми запах війни.
Ja mam pytanie może do pana Ovcharenko, którego...
I have a question to Mr. Ovcharenko, well known to our students, who is often accompanying them during our visits to Ukraine, sharing his interesting experience with us. How is it that you first studied, then you decided to go to the front of the war? So how do you talk about this with your students? Well, thank you for this question and for the invitation. When I went to war, I didn't tell any of my friends. Only 2 people knew about it. Even my parents didn't know, because my family lived in one of the liberated enclaves near Slovansk, so they knew what the war was like, so I didn't want to cause them stress. So I just said that I would be calling them because I was employed in Dnipropetrovsk, and I said that I would call her from time to time. But later on I had to tell them the truth. We were on a blowpost in the second line of the front, and there was beautiful weather. I was on the phone with my mother, sitting in a secret place, and my colleagues next to me observed a movement 500 meters away. The first thing you have to do then is to shoot. So mother asks, what's going on your side? And I said, fireworks. But the colleague shot again. So mom said, what's going on? So I had to tell her the truth, where I was. But at home it was understood. My town of Leman was liberated. My mother was a volunteer in this small town and was also supporting the soldiers. I know this story, but could you tell us how you joined the atoll detachment? So could you remind us how you got away? It all started with Maidan, with the revolution in Kiev. I took part in the protest movement, which was a struggle for human rights, for our rights, for dignity. And that was the initiation. And then when the revolution was at an end, there was the annexation of Crimea, and in the summer of 2014 I was mobilized as a soldier who had served some years earlier. So in the summer of 2014 I was already fighting on the front, defending the border. Between July and August of 2014, when operations were quite active, the Russian artillery was shooting at our positions every day, and we were unable to respond because we were able only to operate on Ukrainian ground, on Ukrainian territory. We couldn't intrude on Russian territory. So we tried to maintain our positions as long as we could. And then in August, we were ordered to withdraw because the situation was critical. We were supported by another brigade, and it was really very difficult because our positions were razed to the ground by Russian artillery every day, according to their orders. Over this brief period of July and August, I understood a lot for myself. First of all, this was a prolongation of Maidan, fighting for freedom and sovereignty of Ukraine. So why did you join ATO? Well, it wasn't an easy decision. It was difficult. But I didn't want to pretend the situation didn't exist. I didn't want to so I took the example of Wallace in Scotland, that he could be deprived of his life but not of his liberty and dignity. And this was the motivation. So it was my conscious decision. I was mobilized, but it was in line with my belief that I wanted to defend the sovereignty of my country, and it was a very strong emotional feeling when for the first time I had to shoot at another man. It was extremely difficult. So how were your doubts, your hesitations? I know it's a very difficult question. So we need to have straight rules. If you don't want to answer, it's up to you. Unfortunately, the doctor who was to be with us to talk about the medical aspect is herself sick and couldn't join us. But it's not so that everybody in Ukraine is ready to serve in the army. Yet you decided to interrupt your career to defend the country. Well, I had simple motivation. I took part in the Donetsk and Kiev Euromaidan. I was at meetings for Ukraine in Donetsk. Half of inhabitants of Donetsk convened there, and we said we don't need any protection against Russia and Putin. At the time I lived in Donetsk, and I saw how Slavyansk was taken over. So we are talking about separatists, but I believe that we should be talking about Russian collaborators or collaboration structures. I see how it was in eastern Ukraine. There were small groups from GRU who took over the local councils. If they couldn't get enough so-called separatists or collaborators, so such 50 people moved around from town to town, taking them over and then passing them over to the local collaborators. So it was a simple situation. As an inhabitant of Donetsk, I believed I should defend it, especially that I saw how it all began. And as I was from Donetsk, it was hard to determine who could be trusted and who could not be, so I had to go join a volunteer battalion. So in September 2014, I was in the volunteer battalion, where there were many people from the eastern Ukraine who were not drafted to the regular forces. And the motivation was simple: to liberate our houses, our country, which was already occupied at the time. And to get rid of the so-called liberators who were occupying it. And also we hear that there is disillusionment with the war by the Ukrainians. It's not so. Ukrainians are ready to keep on fighting. Disillusionment concerns the pace of reform in Ukraine. But the fact that the war is going on for 4 years now, Ukrainians are ready to fight as long as it takes to keep Moscow away.
We know each other, which makes the discussion easier. So a classical question that should be raised at this point in the discussion: what when we talk about this traumatic experience, we're now in a university setting and we sit around a table, but you've had a traumatic experience. So what has remained with you until this day in your professional, social lives? Which elements have become part of your new self, as constitutional components of your personality? For me, the most important thing that I experienced and understood was that you go to bed, but you're not sure whether you're going to wake up, and you're not sure whether you're going to survive the day. So primarily, you learn to appreciate the value of life. You try to live every day as if it was a complete lifespan, not to waste anything. And of course, you start to appreciate the value of peace when you see the losses, casualties, when your friends die, Ukrainian soldiers, when the local people die, inhabitants of Donetsk and Lugansk, Russian people. Then you don't look at this person in terms of nationality, but you look at them as you look at a human being. You want the peace to prevail over war. You want the society and all the resources to be used to solve the conflict in a peaceful manner. So you learn to appreciate the value of peace. War has taught me to be prepared for anything, to be ready. Before the war, I was an ordinary student. I had my training on Friday. I went for a beer. I wrote scientific articles. But when the war started, I never completed a military course or training. I had no preparation. Now, after my participation in the war, I am getting ready to the essential war in the future, because I don't think Putin's going to leave Ukraine alone. And what really was missing from my education is the military knowledge. And on the fourth day, when I came to the battalion, I've understood that I was so unprepared for this sort of action. And later on, I went to understand that I wasn't prepared for many of the challenges in elements of military life. So I will agree that every day of the war teaches us that you need to appreciate every single day of your life. We are sitting here in a hall. We are discussing various things, the geopolitical problems, but there is no guarantee that here in Warsaw there won't be Russian tanks in 5 days. You cannot guarantee that. You might be laughing at this point, but at various NATO conferences that I organized in Donetsk, Hryhoriy Perepelytsya was a guest of ours, and we used to just talk and laugh, and later on it turned out to be the reality. All right, let me now invite Bianka Zalewska, who was a journalist at the war, and especially for some journalists, I think it's not just a profession; it's a mission. It's to tell the world about what was happening in the war. So, how do you view your experience from this time perspective? This was a pretty extreme experience. There was a point where you yourself were in danger. We want everybody to feel free. Speak the language of your choice, please. We have interpretation. It's true, when you work at war with soldiers in such extreme situations where you can actually lose your life, where you become close to death, not just those of people who are near to you, but your own as well. It's difficult later on to go back to normal life. I stopped doing reports afterwards about other topics, and as long as I lived in Ukraine, in Kiev, and when I worked with Espresso, I did that. But even now, living in Poland, I still work with war. It's difficult not to go back there, and both soldiers, journalists and volunteers who were there are still in touch with the people who are still fighting, or people that they met there on location. So with reference to what the boys said, that they value peace, that they appreciate everything that they never noticed before, that we don't notice in our everyday lives. Sometimes I pick up a phone and they say that you have mirne niebo, they have the blue sky over your head. And indeed, I do. Paweł, who is a Polish journalist, used to meet me on the front, and we used to say, we have somewhere to go back to, a safe place to go to, and they don't. They are staying here. And most of the soldiers that were from Donetsk or the region, these are the biggest tragedies. They have no place to go back to and rest. They have to stay where they are. So the war is something that puts people together, but does not allow them to go back to their lives. My superior, who was present here, did not want me to go to such dangerous places. Mykhailo, who wanted me to stay, but he still supported me whenever I did some work on the war, on the subject of the war, and when we organized humanitarian aid. I wanted to go myself. I volunteered to go. I said that I was going to take unpaid leave to go there because I couldn't forget. Do you think contemporary war journalism is passing the test? Do you think that the world is rightly informed about what's happening in the east of Ukraine and in Crimea? Journalism has been very simplified by access to mass media, the fact that mobile phones have become tools of journalists, or just people who are there on location. Sometimes they serve as the channel for communication. I predominantly wanted to show what impact political decisions have, the major political decisions, the impact on the ground, on the battlefront, for the local people of Donetsk, Lugansk, and the whole region, but also for the soldiers who fought on the battlefront. For example, truce announcing truce at midday. We were there, and we knew that we needed to expect the biggest shootings. Soldiers told me that we only have 24 hours left, so the shootings will be very powerful. 2 hours before 12, everybody said, please hide, because there are only 2 hours before the truce is announced, which means that those 2 hours will be full of bombings and shootings, and that was in fact the case. So I tried to show all the effects of those high-level meetings and the impact on the front among soldiers, and how this is perceived, how this is received, and how it impacts their lives in the trenches. And what should societies do not to forget the experience of war, so to carry on that message that Vitalii spoke about? Well, they won't let them forget. Many soldiers and people such as Władysław or Vitalii carry that message through meetings such as today's and their everyday activity. I think that oftentimes influenced by some impressions, when we see some videos or talk to a person who's been impacted by the war, we start thinking that it's worth appreciating peace, but that's a passing, fleeting thought. And being in touch with these people, institutions, the subject matter is the only thing that may protect us and give us the awareness of the threat that exists. I think that Vitalii was the one who told us that in 5 days we can see tanks in Poland, and some people smiled to hear that, but in fact we don't know what may happen. Just as they didn't know in Ukraine 4 years ago that they could have tanks in their country. The first year in the trenches, when I spoke to the people, 80% of the conversations that I had with the soldiers said, listen, I feel as if this is a movie. I would never have expected that. They were so surprised throughout the first months of the war. Nobody could believe it was happening. This was the idea, to sit around the table. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the idea, to have this discussion around the table, to have a commander, soldiers and experts around the same table. And we don't have much time left, but I think now is a good time if you have any specific questions that we would like to address specific individuals. I'm not asking you for comments and thoughts, just simple questions. If you have such, I will give you the floor, Katarina. Simple question. I wanted to go back to the questions of shootings from the territory of Russian Federation. Who are you addressing the question to? Simple question. I'd like to ask experts on international policy and soldiers to answer that question. According to them, that was hard evidence that Russia as a state took part in the aggression against Ukraine. Choose an expert. Address your question. Okay, General Pacek and Stefan Hedlund. So that's a shooting, and according to me, the shootings from across the border of the Russian Federation towards Ukraine is the hardest evidence of aggression. Why is it kept silent, that phase of the war? I think that's being discussed the least. The taking over of buildings is being spoken about, but not this. Zbyszek, please address your question. 2 questions to both generals. The Budapest Memorandum, from your perspective that you've had, what do you think would have been better strategically for Ukraine? To have signed the memorandum and to surrender nuclear weapons, and then to take that into account, or maintain the nuclear weapons? And my second related question, since the memorandum was reached, please just ask your question. Why would I have asked if you hadn't interrupted me? Since the memorandum was reached, according to the international law, is it no longer in force? And if so, does Ukraine have the right to rebuild its nuclear potential? And that's important for Mr. Daniel Fried. Question? A very simple question to General Kowal. If this is a long-term war, to what extent do you think Ukraine is prepared to reconstruct the system of its territorial defense?
Mam pytanie do panów generałów, takie krótkie bardzo. Jak z wojskowego punktu widzenia wyglądało...
From a military point of view, what was the territory of Belarus in the context of the Ukrainian situation? And another question over there?
View, and this will be for the generals and Vitalii and Vlad. What advice would you give to NATO military personnel, such as myself, operating at the tactical and operational level to fight a conflict similar to what you've encountered?
Dziękuję bardzo. Ostatnie pytanie, proszę bardzo.
Last question. Two questions, very short, to Professor Perepelytsya. You criticized the ATO, so what would have been an alternative scenario linked to the necessity of conducting elections? And the second question, more of a summary. We have diagnosed the situation in Crimea and Donbass, and I wanted to ask what happens next. Perhaps the generals, General Koval, what would be the scenario for a solution and the future of the conflict in Donbass? Thank you. Rafat? My question is to you. There is this institution, OSCE, on the 5th of March 2014. For 2 days they tried to get to Crimea, while hard Russian equipment was present already there. So what's the question? The question was that they weren't allowed to the territory of Crimea, the members of OSCE. So why do we need an international organization if it cannot implement its institutions to areas of war? Over there. A question to Ms. Zalewska. How many Polish people are interested in your experiences from the field? Kalman, you're a colleague of mine. I cannot give you the floor. We've had a lot of questions. Let's hear the answers. Who wants to start? General Kowal. You need to precede Koval with general so that I don't have to take the question. No, we're not family. We're not related. The first question was on the Budapest Memorandum and nuclear weapons. It is no secret to you, and I think that we've spoken about this before, that Ukraine in 1991 received the 6th biggest nuclear potential in the world. In Ukraine, Ukrainian territory, there was the 43rd Missile Army that had 2 divisions, and Ukraine held at the time a whole triad of nuclear weapons in its territory. So missiles, aerial missiles, bombers, strategic bombers, terrestrial missiles on the Black Sea, missiles on aerial vessels, and on warships. So when the decision was made to exit the nuclear weapons, Ukraine accepted all the actions that were taken up as part of Budapest Memorandum for many reasons. First, President of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, spoke about it at large. He said that Ukraine was coerced into surrendering its nuclear weapons, that it was coerced by those states that later went on to sign the Budapest Memorandum. And there was a company working in Ukraine, Veitung, that disposed of the missiles. And as a result of that, Ukraine exited the nuclear club. But Ukraine, at the time, was given a guarantee of its security, including, and one of the guarantors was Russia, that they were going to guarantee the integrity of borders and sovereignty. But the guarantor of our independence attacked us and is waging war at us. And about the renewal of nuclear potential, as a military man, I adequately assess our economic capacity. Since this is not an easy situation, one might say, why build a nuclear power plant if it's incorrectly maintained? It could be a problem. So as a member of the military, I have a question. Are we able to correctly store nuclear weapons? Currently, Ukraine is not able to maintain nuclear weapons in a safe and correct manner. So that's why we should fight with the weapons that we have. Of course, we have the option and I understand that very well as a member of the army. What was the actual contribution of Russians? That was part of research. One of the basic actions was firing from areas across the border, close to the border. In fact, there was no border, so it's very difficult to determine whether it was from across the border or not. But Ukrainians themselves assessed that these were areas close to the border. Now, regarding the participation of Russians themselves, there's a lot of evidence, including included in our studies, that Russians are active in Donbass, but to a smaller extent than is often raised by the Ukrainian party, because it's mainly separatists with the assistance of Russians. So the truth was told by General Koval that sometimes Russian brigades entered the Ukrainian territory, whole brigades, but there were temporary and short-term entries. And briefly to Zbigniew's question about the Budapest Memorandum. If Ukrainians had nuclear weapons, nobody would have touched them. We remember Korea. Was there a chance for them not to surrender it? No, there wasn't. Is there a chance for Ukraine to regain nuclear weapons? Very slim, almost non-existent. And very briefly, it was a great question of Doctor, I think, here. What happens next? That's the most important question. What happens next to Ukraine? In my view, this is a never-ending story, unfortunately. We have not raised that. But we will have conferences of this kind in the future. There are 23-25% of Russian population. I often encountered men of my age who cried, officers, colonels, because their father was Russian, their mother was Ukrainian, and they also had a brother. Thank you very much. A question to Professor Perepelytsya. Please be precise. Now, regarding terrorist operations, there were some decisions that were made that had very bad consequences and that were a mistake. The Supreme Council acknowledged that when it decided to deoccupy. I've already said that as a result of the decision on the anti-terrorist measures, we may not use the right to combat terrorists. And however, armed forces participate to a limited extent. We fight as part of the anti-terrorist measures. The powers of the general staff were redirected to the anti-terrorist units. That's why we lost command of the strategic center and we are not able to use our defense capacity. That also negatively impacts our soldiers because we cannot invoke the 51st UN article, and we cannot talk about the Hague and Geneva Conventions. And we also call them separatists, but they're not separatists. They're Russian troops and collaborators. And we ourselves call this conflict internal instead of external. And in this way, we're blocking the international community. Minsk is giving us nothing because Minsk only regulates internal conflicts. And Russia is waging a systematic warfare against us right now. Okay, if there's anything that can be added, please. Just one thought. 2 years ago, in Washington, there was a conference during which the first Ukraine President Leonid Kravchuk said a very important thing. In 1991, there was chaos and everybody feared for the future. Right now, it's Russia that's playing the cards, and we need to take into account that the situation is completely different. We need to say it in a market way. Russia is playing the cards. Bianka. Are many Poles interested in Ukraine? To that question I may answer that yes, a lot, but still not enough. And my reports, my columns, my interviews linked to Ukraine are published on average once a week in Polish television, in a show that is really very popular. And after every video, we have a lot of responses from viewers. They write, they share their experiences, their opinions. However, I think it's important to say that people watch, but they're quiet. There are no studies that would tell us in detail about how many Poles are interested, but we are capable of uniting in a beautiful way. And when I had heroes from Ukraine in my column, people who were in one way or another mutilated or harmed by the war, viewers would always unite. They would call the office, they would find me on social media to try and help them. And thanks to that, a lot of people were healed, humanitarian aid was provided, people were treated or operated on. And I think this is something that we need to take credit for. We can unite if someone is in need of help when we talk about a pure human story, not on political level. But I don't think it's sufficient, although it's still a lot.
Ask your question. Repeat your question, please. Я не слушаю слов. What lessons would you
Nie mamy mikrofonu teraz. We have not micro. Sorry.
Thank you. So what advice would you give to NATO military members who operate at the tactical and operational levels who may encounter a conflict such as what you've experienced?
Thank you.
В першу чергу вважаю, що країни НАТО повинні розглядати серйозно.
We can see that Russia is ready to apply various scenarios and is ready to fight. NATO should be prepared for that. Strengthening international cooperation so that all NATO countries support each other and support their common capacity. And demand Russia to observe international law. If the international community will not exert pressure and demand Russia to observe international law, Russia will do what it wants. So my recommendations to NATO commanders: to exert pressure on their politicians to provide more funding for the army, and to modernize the equipment. I've seen photographs of German tanks, which most of them are not actually operational.
Concern a role of international organizations and its operations, peace operations. So the most experienced and is the United Nations, since it's most of these peace operations are under UN aegis. So there is two types, roughly speaking. It's a fascinating story, but we don't have time. Yeah? So in only one case, it's when we can use so-called Chapter 7 with a peace enforcement operations. We had such operation in Korea in 40s, we had in Somalia in 90s, I believe. Yeah. So in Yugoslavia as well, yeah. Correct. So, but it's rare cases. But it should be, in most cases, big UN operations should be unanimously supported by 5 permanent members of the United Nations. So in case of Russia, so we need all Russian support. So the peace enforcement operation, in case of any Russian involvement, is out of question, yeah? Because Russia will not support them. Yeah? Concerning all other operations are under Chapter 6, and they always need consent of all parties to the conflict. And so if somebody, concerning OSCE, OSCE cannot launch any enforcement operations, but all other presence needs consent of interested parties. In not only, there is no Security Council, that's why all parties, all members of OSCE. Yeah? So probably in this, I settled in this situation was probably there is no prior consent from Moscow. Yeah? That's why it was.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dziękuję bardzo za bardzo konkretne wyjaśnienia. Glen...
Thank you very much for this clear explanation.
This one about territorial defense. Territorial defense is not an act of war. It's wasteful. You spread out everybody that you've got, and you can't concentrate force, and you end up having lots of nothing. So Ukraine does not need territorial defense. It needs mobile defense. It needs people that can move and fight, and with proper logistics. That's really important. The second thing for my NATO colleague, it's exactly the same. You've got to be brilliant at all arms warfare, which means practice, study, and get out on the ground. 70% of your training must be at night. So you're wasting your time sitting in here. You should be out training now with your staff, because the days are slipping away.
Ale my już mamy noc.
Well, we have the night already here. There was a question to you. Would you like to say something? No. I had the impression that there was a question to you. General, the last word belongs to you. We need a military conciseness here. No nie do końca się zgodzę z tezą o obronie. About territorial defense, I wouldn't agree. Because Ukraine, in fact, is preparing to consider a law on territorial defense to provide such detachments. Apart from the regular army, there would be detachments which, apart from military tasks, would rely on local volunteers. Initially, our volunteers were fighting without having any arms, and now they would be provided. And Lithuania has very positive experience in developing territorial defense. So it will be applied in Ukraine, it will provide training and prepare people to guerrilla warfare. And the other issue, Donbass. Currently, we have a law on occupation, and we will free Donbass. We will prepare operations to protect all our borders, and there will be a major operation to get rid of the aggressors from our territory. But I would appeal to the international community to keep an eye on Russia, to make sure that it doesn't apply its strategic advantage on the Caspian Sea, to prevent them from shooting with missiles at Ukrainian territory. The world was silent when missiles were striking against the territory and targets in Ukraine. And after Donbass, we'll have another story with the Crimea, which is Ukrainian and will be recovered. Now we have the following situation. We have only 25 minutes for a meal, and at 8 o'clock we must launch the evening session because one of the participants will have to leave Warsaw by plane.
Банк буде обов'язково. А це